You want me to go? Yeah. All right. Good morning, everybody. We'll let everyone start filling the seats, and we're going to get going because we're a little bit behind schedule, but don't worry, it will be worth it. My name is Lauren Bry, and I serve as the Director of Marketing and Research for EDGE, which is formerly known as the Dairy Business Milk Marketing Cooperative. Our co-op and Dairy Business Association are sister organizations rooted in policy and representing dairy farmers on issues that affect them. While DBA works on Wisconsin-specific issues, the cooperative takes the lead on federal policy. EDGE is proud to represent our dairy farmers and speak up for them on the national level, as well as provide resources for our members to learn more, like this session today. The legislative process and inner workings of government are often hard to understand and difficult to navigate. Many farmers do not have experience in this area, which can make them hesitant to get involved. To be honest, the idea for this session came after the first Dairy Strong conference several years ago when my husband, a dairy farmer, said he thought we should talk more about the basics of government and lobbying so that those just entering the dairy business or those who have been around a while and still have questions could better understand what DBA and EDGE do and how farmers can get involved. So farmers may know that speaking up for themselves when dealing with regulators or policymakers is important, but may not know where to start. And that's what we hope you will get out of this session, along with a little bit of entertainment. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our presenters, my colleagues, Shawn and Erin Stauffacher, who serve as the DBA and EDGE Government Affairs staff, as well as our contract lobbyist, Shawn Pfaff. They're here to give you a crash course in political participation and lobbying, and I can promise it will be entertaining. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren.
Hi, my name is Erin South, and first of all, thank you all for attending our session this morning. We're excited to have you all here. As Lauren said, we developed this session to highlight the importance of you all as a dairy community speaking among our policymakers to be heard at all levels of government, and in what ways your message can be heard. And hopefully throughout our presentation, you'll be able to pick up some strategies on how to do that, as well as maybe identify some feasible opportunities for you to become engaged yourself. As you think of questions throughout the presentation, we'll try to get to them, or we are planning on having a Q&A session at the end. So a little bit about myself. I serve as Associate Director of Government Affairs with both DBA and EDGE Dairy Co-op. DBA on the state side of things, EDGE on the federal side of things. And I've been in this role for about 6 months, but previously I served as an intern for about 2.5 years while I completed my law degree here at UW-Madison. Before that, I attended my undergrad at Stevens Point, and before that, I grew up living and working the issues that you guys are all facing on my family's dairy farm in southwest Wisconsin. So far, working for dairy has certainly been a great experience, and thank you for the opportunity to do so.
Hi everyone, I'm John Holevoet. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for both DBA and EDGE. I know a lot of you guys, looking forward to getting to know more of you. I am a farm kid. I grew up on a hog farm though, so in Illinois.
Oh, jeez.
And then I became a lawyer and then a lobbyist. So I mean, I don't have a great track record. But looking forward to, again, going through the material that Erin already suggested. I get to work with Erin, Shawn, Bill McCoshen and his team, our other contract lobbyists, Dave Crass and their team at Michael Best. And then on the federal side of things with EDGE, we work with Michael Torring Associates, and you'll see some people from their office later as the conference goes on. So looking forward to seeing you guys later, and also hopefully building upon this presentation for ways that you could get more involved.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Erin. My name is Shawn Pfaff. I grew up on a dairy farm in northern La Crosse County, just north of Holmen, Wisconsin, if you know that. My background is I'm your contract lobbyist, one of them. My profession is less popular than cockroaches and shares. So to be a lobbyist is something that I take pride of, even though many people have positive notations of that. My background is I lobby in the state capitol for you, but I've done rural and agricultural and trade policy at the state level for a governor, as well as I worked 3 years on Capitol Hill in DC. And it's just an honor to fight for the dairy industry in this state. So thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to kick things off here. Erin's done a fantastic job, and Lauren, thanks for everything for setting this up. Why are you here today? You are here today because it is your constitutional right. And as a guy who just turned in his mid-40s, I got to use reading glasses now for the first time. But I wanted to read something to you from the Ethics Commission, which really lays this out. Everybody wants to complain about who lobbyists are, what do they do, this and that. But it is your First Amendment right to petition the government. The legislature declares that the operation of an open and responsible government requires that the fullest opportunity be afforded to people to petition their government for the redress of grievances and to express freely to any officials of the executive or legislative branch their opinions on legislation, on pending administrative rules, and other policy decisions by administrative agencies on current issues. So thank you for being engaged in your constitutional right to petition your government, which was part of our Bill of Rights more than 200 and some years ago. But the reason why it's so important that you are here, not just because it's your constitutional right and you wanted to come to Madison maybe in January, is because you represent a major economic player in our state. There is a lot of talk about what direction Wisconsin's going and all that stuff, and that'll be discussed in 2018 on your TV screens here. But there is no doubt that agriculture, an $88 billion industry, and dairy, $44 billion of that, are a huge economic and cultural player in this state. You can just tell that Wisconsin agriculture still matters in this state, and the Dairy Business Association, the work that you've done to organize yourself, has really sent a notice in the Capitol. And why it's so important now in 2018. All of us up here came from the farm. John happened to not mention he's a Bears fan too, so that's maybe another negative, but anyway. Sorry, John. But Erin and I are first generation off the farm. Erin's probably more engaged in his dairy than mine is because my parents sold the dairy cows 12 years ago. But there isn't many of us left first generation off the farm, especially in the state capitol. Yes, you're dealing with partisan divide in politics, no doubt about it. We all know Republican, Democrat, and we're all probably frustrated with both of those choices. But we're also dealing with a geographic divide in this state. And you've seen it in the last 20 years play out, and especially the last 10 years in this state. Urban versus rural, Milwaukee and Madison versus the rest of the state. So many of the issues we talk about are on a geographical basis. And agriculture, especially dairy with its $44 billion impact, many of us being from the farm, but sadly more of us being removed generation from the farm, understand, they think for the most part across the street in the Capitol and our representation in Washington, that they know what it means. But keep in mind that rural-urban divide. I'll say that this came out, and John and Erin work with me closely, and they sometimes know that Shawn can have some fits of rage when it comes to certain things coming across the Capitol. There was a serious proposal to change the license plate. Now, maybe that's not a big deal, but think of what's on the license plate. And when it was put out, the author of that proposal said that maybe agriculture, especially dairy, wasn't as important of an economic engine as we should consider something new. And we had to do some work, and these guys especially and me got together and we educated people the importance of dairy, and most people, excluding the governor and others, said, you know what, this makes sense. Of course we're going to keep America's Dairyland on the license plate. But that just tells you that every day that goes by and as every generation passes, we have to make sure we stay connected to the farm. So thank you for coming today.
Now, Erin has done a great job of putting together this whiz-bang presentation. It's a new style for us. It's called Prezi. He's a millennial. I'm being forced into this. It's literally the hippest thing I've done in 10 years. But the imagery we'll use in this presentation, it means more than just a QC factor, right? So we're using the imagery of icebergs. And it's a metaphor for the presentation, and it's a metaphor for the work we do. So it's a metaphor for the presentation because we're really just showing you the tip of the iceberg. This just is sort of an appetizer of what you could get involved with, right? Sort of whet your appetite for future opportunities to get more involved. whether that's a lobbying day in Madison or a fly-in DC for EDGE, if it's having a legislator out to your farm or meeting with them in district. Maybe it's serving on one of our boards or one of our committees. We have 2 different policy committees, one both for the association and for the co-op. We hope you'll reach out to us afterwards, either right after this presentation or throughout the conference, and even after the conference, if something piqued your interest here, you'll want to be more involved. It's also a metaphor for the work that we do in that above water, you see maybe some of the controversy, you see some of the successes, at times you see some of the failures, but you don't see a lot of the behind the scenes of what we're doing. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about sort of what happens behind the curtain that often isn't in the media, thankfully. I say to the handful of media in the room. But is nonetheless important and something we really have to keep focused on. Now, above that water, things that we definitely see, we can see issues that are impacting us on the dairy. We can see a headline just from this week dealing with new drinking water rules. This is the NR 151 revisions that are going to impact the eastern part of the state. We see a whole host of other issues. These are things that I think all of you guys are going to recognize, whether it's dealing with the regulatory system in the state or on the federal side, different land use restrictions or property right issues. Erin has that little cartoon down there about the Waters of the United States rule or the WOTUS rule. Here we have a guy from EPA investigating your bird bath to make sure it's not a water of the United States. That's obviously a tongue-in-cheek sort of extreme example, but the reality is where we thought that rule might be going before it's since been pulled back, it's not that, it's less than that ridiculous, but it's not that much less than that ridiculous. Things about sustainable workforce and immigration reform. Poor or unpredictable policies that leave you wondering whether you're doing the right thing or not, or if you're doing the right thing today, but maybe in a year from now you'll be told you did the wrong thing. Better access to foreign markets, promoting trade, safeguarding NAFTA, and protecting modern farming practices and helping the public to understand them.
Well, I think I want to talk about one of the things that frankly was the centerpiece of this organization, and it was Livestock Siding. And a little bit of a personal story here. First point on the slide there, I talked to Erin about this. He's our millennial guy, and he's, we're teaching him institutional knowledge, a couple old salts like John and me. So I wanted to tell him what was to me. 1994, I graduated from high school in 1989, went away to college, thought about going back home, maybe farming, maybe not. My dad never thought I was really serious, and maybe he was right. But in 94, a huge shockwave was sent across the country. California had beat us in milk production. That was a psychological thing and an economic thing. And it kind of talked about how dairying in Wisconsin maybe had passed, is gone, contracting, smaller. And it was an organization like this in 2000, some of the old names, and I don't want to get in trouble for naming them, but Jerry Meisner and John Vries and people in 2000, John Pagel, others that got together, and many of you in this room, said, we got to do something about this. Society's changing, dairy producing is changing. A generation, frankly, my generation was told to leave after the dairy herd buyout in the mid-'80s, late 80s. Kids younger than me were coming home to farm, and they wanted to be part of it. How do you do it? And you folks in this room were progressive enough to say, hey, maybe we listen to what Grandpa and Dad did, but we got to take care of the next generation. So you did your constitutional right. You formed an organization because of like-minded individuals. And you were based around one major issue, siding. That's where I first had the honor of meeting Dave Crass and Bill McCoshen when I worked for Governor Doyle. Who would have thought? Doyle, a Democrat from West Madison, Attorney General, just assumed he was in with the environmentalists and all this stuff. He reached out through Secretary Nielsenstoon to John Gard, who this organization knew well, Speaker at the time. McCoshen and Crass knew those guys well, Lori in her day when she was here. And we came together and we created this law known as ag siding. Now it already is 18 years ago. Siding was done in the mid-2000s, so it was 12, 13 years ago. You were formed 18 years ago. And look what's happened since. And what that means is you've now given yourself the ability to work with local governments, but to expand and have the stability to be able to talk to your lenders, to talk about advancing and modernizing Wisconsin agriculture. Truly an issue that would not have been done if it would not have been folks like this organizing, using their constitutional right, but also working in a bipartisan manner, and to frankly reinvigorate Wisconsin dairy, where 30-some years ago, when I left the farm, we didn't know what was going to happen. So that's the start of DBA for those of you that are a little newer to the group or learning more about it, but to the old-timers in the room, you certainly know this story. So what we have now is we have the bedrock of who we are, why we gathered, and how we now, John, Erin, where am I going next? Am I going to you on this one next?
I'm
Okay, off to Erin on the next slide.
So as livestock siding it's a policy, which is the second main item above the water, if you can kind of tell where we are on the slide. You know, policy is made up of the statutes, rules, the regulations, standards that make up the plethora of guidelines that the government has put in place to serve as constructs for which you have to operate your farm or business within. Locally, zoning exists as a coordination of future land use. Localities enact ordinances through their police power, and those ordinances are specific to their town or county, while some of you are intimately familiar with the ins and outs of the WPDS CAFO permitting program and that regulatory framework. And we all know, unfortunately all too well, that milk margin protection program didn't quite turn out how everyone was expecting. Well, what do we need policy to look like? As John alluded to, many of the issues that we are facing are in fact rooted in the shortcomings in existing policy. We need policy to be able to give you all the ability to make the best and most practical decisions for your farm or business. And so what's the end game? So I kind of did some thinking and came up with a definition that we're working towards a predictable set of rules and guidelines that allow you to maximize efficiencies, resources, and profitability on your farm. And so subjectively thinking, I developed this kind of cool word cloud. I think it's cool. It took a while. You know, I think when I think of good policy, I think, you know, it's got to be predictable, it's got to be proportionate, transparent, practical, consistent, targeted, and effective. You know, it has to be predictable in the sense that it's approachable on the front end, but it gives you the long-term certainty that you need in the back end. Proportionate in the sense that you're not cracking the nut with a sledgehammer. It's the remedy that's initiated is proportionate and appropriate to the risk that is posed while costs are being minimized. And it needs to be targeted in that it needs to focus on the problem at hand and avoid a scattergun approach. And skipping over a few, I'm proud of the rest of them. Lastly, they need to be effective. Plain and simple, they need to work for you guys. So if you're watching closely, we now dip below the iceberg. So above we had our issues, and then we kind of jumped to the end game, that's policy, but what's in the middle? And maybe I oversimplified it with these 3 bullet points, but we're going to walk you through where to start, and then we're gonna work you through the meat grinder, you know, the process side of things. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the Schoolhouse Rock video, I'm Just a Bill. Shawn's actually going to sing it for us in a little bit, whether he knows that or not. And then we're gonna walk you through the end. So where do we start? Well, first of all, we need to know, when do we start? And to that, I would say immediately. If there is a negative impact that is affecting your business, or a roadblock exists that's standing in your way that is not allowing you to make the best possible decision for your farm, it should be addressed. Fact of the matter is that, you know, you might think it's a minuscule matter, but it's more than likely there's someone else going through the same problem. Yes, I think it's pretty obvious that we can all gather around as an industry to approach the bigger issues like trade, stable workforce, and regulatory reform on a broad scale. But what about those minute details And that's what we need to work through to craft the best policy and fine-tune the best policy that gives you guys the ability to work. So, and chances are that people that might have the ability to do something about your problem might not have heard about it. This applies to the bureaucrats in all of our agencies, our elected officials in both capitals, but it also applies to me and John. We can act as excellent soundboards to hear out all of your issues, and hearing from a broader agricultural community, we can hopefully pattern some of those issues and recognize where the overarching issue is, obviously, of course, with Shawn, Bill, and Michael Best with Dave Crass. But government is a huge organization, and recognizing the overarching source of our concerns could be kind of confusing if you're not familiar with it. So that's why you belong to DBA, EDGE, and we work hard for you here in Madison, out in Washington, D.C. So I probably oversimplified it again, but this slide serves as a purpose that it's pretty confusing. So I have it broken down into the three jurisdictions. So you got your town, county board, your state agency, your state, and then federal. And within each of those 3 bullet points, there are several layers that are interconnected, overlapping, and part of the bigger process under the mass. So for instance, when you might have an issue at a local issue, such with your town or county board, yes, you could probably approach the issue by talking with those members, but because local governments are a creature of state law, it might be an issue that your representative or senator can better handle, such as a weird click in the zoning law or something like that. Or another outlet for those problems, such as livestock siding, as it's administered by DATCAP. An agency could be your outlet, but those agencies might also be the problems to your concerns, which is sometimes the case here in the state. But the fact of the matter is that agencies act through powers delegated to them by our elected officials, our senators and representatives, so they can act as a sounding board to hopefully rein in agencies. And agencies are under a bigger executive branch framework, so if you have someone good in the governor's office, like Governor Walker, we could hopefully work through some back channels there. And on the federal side of things, we have this thing called federalism, which I won't bore you with constitutional law, years of it in law school that John and I have had the opportunity to experience. But, well, federalism is the relationship between our state and national government. And it deals with the interrelationship of who has the authority to regulate a certain subject matter. For example, to kind of show the interrelatedness of it all, I'm pretty sure some of you guys are familiar with the WPDS program. Well, our state's WPDS CAFO permitting program is administered by our state DNR. But it was delegated to our state by the federal government because it's part of a broader national program called the MPDS program, which is part of the Clean Water Act, which is administered by the EPA, which the Clean Water Act was duly enacted through our elected Congress and then signed by the president well before I was born. And my thrust with the slide was to point out that everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. And there might be more than one way to skin a cat. I try to use cats a lot. But it also shows that there might be more than one way to fix an issue, and to best identify the best opportunity to fix that issue, we need to figure out what it is you're dealing with, the subject matter of the jurisdiction where the subject matter lies, and who is best to contact. So as I said, DBA and EDGE, John and I, and our hired guns, our lobbyists, and our legal team really stress to be proactive and reach out before it's too late. We're always available, as our boss Tim likes to say, 24/7.
So it's about finding your people, right? That's a big part of this. You don't have to be in this alone. In fact, you don't want to be in this alone. You're not going to be nearly as effective. And for better or worse, we're your people. So reach out to us and be in touch with us. We've got the mission statements for both organizations up there. You'll see interwoven in both of those a focus on policy. That's no surprise to people who are familiar with these organizations long term. That's a big part of who we are, and that's a big part of who we'll continue to be. We want to make sure we give you opportunities to engage. We want to make sure we're there with you doing that engagement. And we have a lot of different opportunities to participate. We've started this year a new policy webinar series. They've been relatively popular. We're going to continue that going forward. We've got legislative engagement teams. If you in your local area now want to be a member of a legislative engagement team, just see one of us. What that means is you'll be a part of a core group of farmers from your Senate district and your Assembly district, and we'll put you in touch with both your Assembly person and your state senator, and we'll make sure that we start developing that relationship. We want that elected individual to think when they get a new bill that deals with agriculture, you know who I should reach out to. Not necessarily us, although that's fine too, but also the 3 farmers who are part of that team who I've built this relationship with. If I'm getting this bill, I should call Dan or Bill and ask them how this will impact their farm. We have lobbying day opportunities. In fact, Ag Day at the Capitol is next week. That is a Farm Bureau event, but DBA, in an effort to try and get more of our members involved, we have co-sponsored that event for a long time. We're offering you booze afterwards. So please come and lobby during the day and drink with us in the evening. You've probably got emails about that already. We also have DC fly-ins. We had 2 last year. We've got 1 coming up in March for the co-op. We're going to have another opportunity for some farmers to go out later in June. If that's of interest to you, please see us. Again, the committees that I referenced earlier, our summer policy picnics where you get to hear Erin and I do a presentation like this, whatever. We basically go and talk wherever Lauren tells us to go and talk.
Got to be president.
Really, we just want to we want to provide you a place and a space where you can have your voice heard. So how does this process work? Well, if you're dealing with a lot of your different problems, what you're probably trying to fix is a statute or an ordinance that's giving you problems. Now, depending on whether it's a statute or an ordinance, it depends on where you go, as Aaron said and sort of explained in his last slide. Maybe that's local government, maybe that's state government. You go about fixing that through legislation, whether it's a new ordinance or a new bill that would amend existing statute. Legislative fixes are meant to correct problems, but they also highlight that first point there, which is the relationship between administrative rules and statutes. Just because you have the statute fixed, it might trigger a whole new set of administrative rules, and that basically those rules are the rules written by the administrative agency that enforces those statutes, that sort of flesh out the statute and explain how they're going to go about doing whatever the statute commanded they do. So you'll have to be involved in that process too. So it's sort of going through the follow-through. You think you've got the bill passed, it got signed by the governor, you think that's the end. Really, it might just be the beginning of a lengthy administrative rule process, which is likely as important to the process as what you've been doing up to that point. You also want to find your champion. That's the next bullet point there. And you've got some options, right? You've got 99 people in the Assembly. You've got on the federal side, 435 people in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, we've got 33 here in the state and 100 in DC. You might think you always want your champion to be your representative, and in a perfect world, that makes a lot of sense, or at least that's a good starting point. But they may not always be well suited for a whole number of reasons. First of all, you might be represented by somebody who doesn't really represent your values. They just happen to represent some of the values of other people who voted in that same election. So you might have to look beyond your district to find someone who really understands what you're facing on your farm. Even if you have someone who's sympathetic, they might just be a good person to start you down the path, because really maybe because of the committees they serve on, other time commitments they have, they're not the best person to take whatever initiative you're working on and lead it forward. You need to try and find someone on Ag Committee maybe, because that's where the bill's likely to go. You don't want to necessarily start with your person as your main champion if they don't have any close connections with the other people on that committee. You might want to use them as a way to figure out who's the best person to work on with this. Would you like to help me try to address this? Who should I be in touch with? They'll be able to make those connections even if they're not the person who helps you long term.
So the champion's also the main lead on who's doing the work behind the bill. But secondly, another important point is securing co-sponsors. Co-sponsors play an important strategic role, as John alluded to with the champion. For instance, you want as many people on the most likely committee that the bill is heading to, but also this stage serves as a kind of a jumping off point where the way that the last-ditch effort to see if there's any more co-sponsors in the legislature is a pretty broad email sent out to the legislative listserv. For example, Shawn talked about license plate deal. We didn't know what Representative Scott Allen was plotting behind the scenes to remove America's Dairyland from our license plate, but when it came out, seeking co-sponsors, he received none, fortunately, through the work that we did and cheesemakers. But it became public, and that's when the media found out, and so that's a big step where we have to be prepared for that. So after co-sponsors are secured, it gets introduced and assigned to a committee. A lot of the things that we deal with are in the Ag Committee, so we want to monitor who's on that committee. We want Ag people, your representatives, hopefully, on those committees in both the Assembly and the Senate. And that serves another important point of having co-sponsors and your champion on that committee. Because if you guys remember Schoolhouse Rock, where does the bill go to die? It goes to die in the committee. After all the bills are introduced, they all go to a committee, but very few get acted on. And it's important, if your bill's going to go anywhere, you need a champion, you need a co-sponsor in that committee to be your guy with skin in the game when they go back in to discuss the bill and to make amendments, that they're there to voice your opinion and get it onto the first step. And the first step is the hearing. They notice it, and the first action item to get it moving is a public hearing, which John will cover.
Who's that handsome devil? Oh, that's me. I think that's what Mr. Talkin would call a healthy eater. This is me at the hearing on high-capacity wells. Next to Cody Heller, we both testified on behalf. We were actually one of a handful of different people who went and testified at that hearing for you about the high-capacity well bill this session. Right now, what we're going to do, though, is we're going to kind of walk you through a little bit of a mock hearing. We're going to have Shawn play the role of lacrosse dairyman. Our bill that we're going to be talking about is up there. It's a fictitious bill, but one that we hope to make a reality very soon, which deals with transferring permitting authority over CAFOs from the Department of Natural Resources to DATCAP, the Department of Ag. So Shawn's going to go ahead and give his spiel. We're going to look at what he does. I'm going to play the role of villain, role I enjoy, and I'm going to ask him some questions as he's testifying.
Well, good morning, members of the Assembly Agriculture Committee. My name is Shawn Pfaff. I'm a third-generation dairy farmer from northern La Crosse County. Representative Smith, it's nice to see you, and thanks for coming to the farm last summer. I'm here today as a longtime community member and as a multi-generational dairy farmer who employs nearly 20 people in my hometown with an economic impact of almost $3 million to talk in support of AB 699. You're going to hear a lot of conversations about what we should and shouldn't do, but I can tell you as a dairy farmer who represents $44 billion of economic activity in this state, we think this legislation will go a long ways to provide stability, profitability, and generational transfer in Wisconsin agriculture. And I'd urge you today to listen to my fellow colleagues that are here taking time away from their farm, Not fancy lobbyists like Shawn, who happens to be representing us today, but they're here because they care about this and the future of their state. So thank you for listening to my testimony.
Now, what do you say to people who say that we're turning over permitting to the agency that is just basically a cheerleader for dairy farmers and agriculture?
Well, Representative Jones, that's a great question, and we as farmers care dearly about the land. My family's been in Northern La Crosse County since 1871, so we understand how to conserve land, and we're active in the conservation efforts up there. We think what a better chance for an agency that understands farm economies, understands conservation of the land, who works closely shoulder to shoulder to promote and regulate dairy policy so we can move forward in our economy. So that's why we think we should transfer from DNR to DATCAP.
So Shawn's a smooth operator, and Erin's going to critique him a little bit too. And it might even be intimidating for some of you, but we can help you write your testimony. Although, frankly, what works for Shawn is he's talking because he actually believes it. And you guys do too. I know it from when I talk to you guys on the phone about issues that you're facing, about how sincere you can be in your presentation. Other people who testified at that hearing did a great job, and the best part of it was when they were asked questions and could answer from their heart about their own operations. I just saw Dan Dietrich testify at a hearing recently. He did an excellent job, again, for the same reason, because he could bring it home and make it personal, and that's what connected with the legislators.
Jack, can I just add
Yeah,
something there real
absolutely.
quick? Taking off Shawn, the wannabe farmer hat. You're real. Lawmakers want to see real. Not that John and Erin and I aren't real people. Obviously, we are, but they see us every day. We're honored to fight for you in the Capitol. But when Representative Tauken, who is a great champion for our industry, when he sees a farmer from Bondwell or a farmer from Shawano County or a farmer from Richland County, and he hears that person, guy or gal, testify, it takes actually a lot more resonates with those lawmakers because they can hear us, okay, Shawn, what's the real story here? What's going on? Boy, that gentleman from Chippewa Falls was awesome. Thanks for getting him. And actually, many times, leadership is encouraging committee chairpersons to get real people from the industry. Whether it be Steve, who owns a bar in Rhinelander, talking about X, Y, and Z for the Tavern League, or Bob, the chiropractor from Oshkosh, talking about chiropractor issues. They want to hear the real McCoy, as you will. And so that's why we'd love to get you to come and do more of these hearings for us.
So as you notice, Shawn was pretty concise, clear, and he was personal with it, as John mentioned. And I won't cover what they did, but we tried to break it down into three simple things. We need to focus, whenever you're communicating with a lawmaker, policymaker, keep it simple, the KISS method. So he focused on who he was, why this mattered to him as a dairy farmer in the area, so why does this bill make a difference? But then there also needs to be an element of persuasion in there that convinces the elected official up there as a representative of their constituents that why they should support the bill. And so that's the main thing of getting it over the hump. So getting back on track, and we're running low on time, so I'm gonna fly through here. So the next step is going through the amendment process. And amendments they serve three things. They incorporate feedback from the hearing, they make the bill a better bill, but they also politically play a part in securing the votes that they need to get the bill out of committee and before a full vote before the legislature. So after amendments are introduced, the committee goes into executive session, and while it's important to have your co-sponsors or champions on the bill, that's when they go behind closed doors, they vote on the amendments, they discuss the bill, and hopefully they vote it on to go before the full legislature. And remember, this is a dual process, so we have to have champions in both the Senate and Assembly to get it before both full chambers. And the last legislative push. So you might have seen some emails, some messages, social media. Joanna does a great job pushing this stuff. You might recognize these messages as kind of a call to action. And we hope that if you do have some time in the day that you see this, is when we send these out, we're encouraging you all to act, to reach out to your elected officials. Those last minute calls serve as a gauge for those folks on, how are the constituents back home feeling about a particular issue. I learned something kind of cool out in DC. When they take calls, they have a tally sheet for, against, who called. And this also deals with the license plate issue as it's very real.
Erin, real quick.
Go for it.
As you can see, the way Erin and John framed this with their media team, call to action, who to call, economic impact, message points of persuasion, all airtight for you to put that into broad concepts to tailor to your message. That's the most effective way to do that, because these people are getting pounded with calls every day, especially in DC right now. Thank you, Erin.
So we'll talk now about the finish and the follow-up. It also goes back to something I mentioned in the previous slide. We're hoping the governor or the president, depending if we're talking about state or federal, they sign the bill into law. But that's not necessarily the end. You might have several other steps. First of all, the statutory fix may not be the end-all, be-all. You might need to worry about cleanup bills or trailer legislation later. But even if it accomplished what you were hoping it would from a bill perspective, we're back at worrying about whether we might need to deal with administrative rules. I'll just go over this real quickly, but the rulemaking process there has outlined all the different steps from scope statement to potentially there's sometimes a committee of advisors or a technical advisor committee that convenes to help them. The agency drafts the rule. There's a public comment period. Usually both you can submit written comments or there's usually one or two or maybe even more hearings across the state. There's board approval in some situations if the agency happens to have a board that plays that function. Both natural resources and DATCAP, they both have those kinds of boards. So for the rules that we deal with most often in our area, we have that step. Then there's legislative approval, and ultimately governor would have to sign off on the rule. What's done there, you might notice that some of those are italicized. Those italicized items up there are your chances for public input, all the different chances you have along that process, which it's not atypical for it to take multiple years for an administrative rule to be done. Those are opportunities for you to engage, for farmers to get involved, and to make a difference in what the end product might look like. There's also implementation after the rule's done, which sometimes that can be as important as writing it too, making sure that what the spirit of the rule is actually being carried out by staff. Next, we'll look at outcomes. One of the things we're going to do here on this slide is toot our own horns a little bit, but also tooting your horns by extension because you've supported us in this past year. We've been able to accomplish different things. Up there at top, we talk again about sort of how you might not be done. One example of that is high capacity wells, which was a victory for us this year, but only addresses existing wells, does not address new wells that might be permitted. There's court case going on right now about how new wells are permitted. We'll wait to see the outcome of that court case, and it might require additional legislation then. But at least that is what I would say one of our biggest accomplishments, and it shows sort of that this might have to be the long haul. That was 6 years in the making, that piece of legislation, before it was done. We had the Act 21 lawsuit, which Dave is going to highlight in his presentation next in this room. We had, and we're working on right now, trying to transfer the KFU program, like we talked about and like Shawn testified in our mock hearing here about. We got it in the governor's budget. It was removed from the governor's budget. We've revived the concept, and we're working hard to try and finish it before the legislative session ends. There's also administrative rules out there that we've been working on as well, whether that's NR 151, the one we talked about already, dealing with water quality in the eastern part of the state, or ATCP 51, which is livestock siding, which impacts a whole host of counties across the state and towns across the state that have adopted that for how local governments can regulate your farms. Those are all things that we've worked on a lot and I think have seen a great deal of progress on. Some are done, some are in process. If you think the event horizon for state work is long, the event horizon for federal work makes that look quick. Like we're really accomplishing a lot fast. One of the things that EDGE has done in this last year, we did retain a contract lobbying firm in DC, and we've been able to build strategic partnerships that have been really important. I think that's actually our biggest thing going forward. We're going to be working on things dealing with the Ag Act or other immigration-related bills, NAFTA and other trade-related issues, and the Farm Bill going into 2018. Those are going to be the things that probably take up most of our time. But we're going to rely upon those partnerships we've started to build and are going to continue to build through these fly-in events and also through other periodic contact with their offices to make sure that we basically, once we've planted the seeds of those relationships, we water them occasionally to make sure they grow into something productive.
So the next slide I'm going to introduce from Washington, D.C. Our federal lobbyist, Mike Torrey, he couldn't be here today as he worked for Senator Bob Dole, and Senator Dole is getting an
Congressional
award this
Gold
week.
Medal
Yeah,
today, so we'll be there.
He's there today. So this is one of our last parting messages.
So coming to Washington, D.C., it is so important that members of Congress, your elected representatives, and the staff that work for them have a face with voice from the folks back in the district. They need to know what you're thinking, what you're experiencing, and they need to hear the story from you as members.
So that kind of wraps it up for both. You know, he addressed the federal flying, the importance of flying out to DC and meeting with folks, and when they come back to the district. I think every one of our Wisconsin state reps comes back to Wisconsin every weekend, and you know that serves as a great opportunity for you guys to meet them, and the importance of that duly serves as the importance of coming to Madison, and hopefully maybe we even enticed you guys to join us for Ag Day, and then have a few drinks with us at Madison's afterwards. So I get
Erin, we can't pick on John too much from being from Illinois because he did give us Abraham Lincoln. And everybody has a little Lincoln that they enjoy and love, and we all are fascinated with Lincoln. And I worked with Erin and John and found this quote, and I think it perfectly frames what we're trying to do. Our government rests in public opinion. Whoever can change public opinion can change the government practically just so much. Abraham Lincoln, 1856. We all know the rest of the story there. So, take questions, Erin?
Yeah, so any room for questions?
Jim.
Jim, do you mind, we're going to yell at us if we don't have you use the mic because they're going to record, they're recording everything.
Oh,
But one of us can come and give you the mic.
We'll repeat it, John. We can repeat the question.
Oh, that's fine
All right,
too.
this guy's got it right here. I'll give it to him.
Lloyd's on.
Thanks, Lloyd. Good, bud. There you go.
The pros and cons of DAC taking over the KFRA program.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. I think the pros are that we'll end up with an agency that I think understands agriculture better. I think we're also going to see that we don't have as much duplication and effort. All the things when it comes to fisheries, for example, if there's a problem with fisheries, DNR is going to have that. But right now what we have is we actually have people at DNR who specialize in nutrient management planning or think they specialize in nutrient management planning, who are reviewing those plans as part of your application. And we have the same expertise, in fact, better expertise at DATCAP already. We have people who specialize in sort of the ag engineering and the site design aspect of things and work in livestock siding at DATCAP. And then we have people at DNR who are doing that. So it's going to be a streamlining, I think, of the number of people who have to be involved. I think it's also a fresh start for that program. It's not just about moving that program. It's about building into that program new efficiencies to make it work better. Responding, there was a legislative audit that some of you might have followed that looked at some of the deficiencies and how the program probably wasn't meeting even the internal benchmarks that DNR had set for themselves about being timely in response to applications, both new applications and renewals. Our hope is also to work with DATCAP to make sure they have adequate staff to receive the program and to make it a better program all around. Some of the other changes we're looking at would be things to build in, like I said, efficiencies when it comes to like a certified program for engineers and a certified program for nutrient management program planners, similar to the Assured program that's already underway for wetland delineators. So this kind of helps make the program move more smoothly and also probably saves overall staff time to review the applications as they come in.
Jen, real quick, just to Jim's point, this perfectly fits into the box that Erin talked about. What we're trying to do with craft policy, Jim, to make it more efficient, flexible, but those are subjective words, who can be backed by sound research and science, which we can do, but other sides that we're maybe opposed to or haven't bought into what we're doing yet, so to speak, we have to convince. So it goes in that policy lens of fair, flexible, pragmatic, all of those things. So that's a perfect example of what Erin was trying to convey there. And as this commissioner said this morning, sometimes you got to change some stuff. You know, you got to make, and I think we can make the argument that John's saying, based on all the positives, but also through that broad lens of policy goals. $88 billion dairy industry. We want to efficient, modernize, but also protect the environment, because as somebody's testimony said from northern La Crosse County, we care about the land. That's why we make our money. Been in our family forever. So that's kind of how we would tackle that big picture based on the specifics that John just said.
And I think as far as cons, Jim, really from my perspective, it's mostly about optics, right? That some people will see this as a bad move. But for those reasons I just outlined, they have the resources. They're also already a regulatory agency for all of our dairy farms. In fact, they're the regulatory agency that visits all dairy farms at least once a year, some as many as 3 times a year. So it's overcoming those misperceptions that my question to Shawn was actually meant to bring out, that somehow DATCAP's just a cheerleader. Well, they are a cheerleader, one aspect of them. In fact, that's sort of Dan Smith's department at DATCAP, and he's here today with us. And we appreciate the work that his section of the department does. But there's also a regulatory function. There's also a planning function. All those things already exist there and would probably work better for permitting farms, at least.
Question of the crowd. How many of you have had a lawmaker or someone running for office or a community leader, whether it be your county board member, town board member, school board member, or the school superintendent or the FFA teacher, visit your farm or your business? Fantastic. Because then what happens is Representative Jones says, hey, John, Erin, and Shawn, thanks, welcome to the office. Boy, I had a great time on that dairy farm there in Greene County. Just great. They're expanding. They're good people. I've known them for years. Makes our job much easier if you do. And back to John's point earlier about visits and stuff like that, we love setting that stuff up and doing those kind of things because it helps us greatly. It helps. Did you give me this quote, Erin? 7% of Americans think that brown milk comes from brown cows? True. So that's what we're dealing with in some of the ignorance that's happening as more and more people get away from the farm. A couple more questions at all? We'd love to answer one more.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
If we can, I guess we'd start back in on the next session. Good morning, I'm Lloyd Holterman, a partner in Rosie Lane Holsteins and a member of the Dairy Business Association Board of Directors. On behalf of DBA and our session sponsor, Michael Best, I'd like to introduce our breakout session speaker, David Crass. David Crass is a partner and Michael Best serves on the firm's management committee and is a co-chair of the Agribusiness Food and Beverage Industry Group. David grew up on a Wisconsin dairy farm, is a cum laude graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School, and has been DBA's primary outside general counsel since the very beginning. David led the team that represented DBA in a successful lawsuit against the Department of Natural Resources this year, which was a big achievement, and that's the subject of this talk. His agribusiness industry clients include producers, processors, manufacturers, distributors of agricultural food and beverage products. Please help me in welcoming David Crass.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Lloyd, and welcome everyone. Just what a great session to be able to follow in terms of what John, Shawn, and Erin just put together in front of you. The quote from Abraham Lincoln reminded me of another one of my most favorite quotes, and this is from Woody Allen. And Woody Allen said it kind of the same message in a slightly different way, that the world is run by those who show up. And really that presentation was all about that, is showing up. And hopefully in what I cover in my talk, you'll see the importance of that. I am decidedly not a millennial like Erin, and you'll see a lot of words on this presentation. We're going back to two-dimensional form, PowerPoint, and you'll see no word clouds, however. So this is what I'm going to cover today. Now, I know that Dairy Strong is larger than just a Wisconsin event, so I'm going to try to hit some messages that really I think can apply in whatever state you're in, and not be entirely Wisconsin specific, because what really this presentation is grounded in is regulatory reform, which is a matter talked about a lot in Congress and at various state houses, and it's also a little bit of a continuation of your Civics 101 course earlier. In order to tell this story, which happened really in 2016 and 2017, we really need to go back 5 years and look at regulatory reform that commenced with Governor Walker's administration in 2010, 2011. And it's really an Act 21 prologue. It's the story, the introduction to the story. And just a little civics reminder here on this screen, and that is that laws are developed by the legislative power that is vested in our elected representatives. Obviously, the members of the House of Representatives and Senate and Assemblies and Senate in the, playing off of the last presentation. Laws are then enforced by the executive branch. Remember, we've got the three branches of government, legislative, judicial, and executive. And the executive branch and the administrative agencies who are then populated by the executive branch, that authority and power really of the administrative agencies to regulate your business operations flows from the legislature. It flows from congressional acts. So we have to remember where the power is and who makes the laws versus who enforces them or implements them in a business setting. We talked about the administrative rulemaking process just a little bit in the prior presentation. Those agencies write those critical rules, and that's what a lot of this case is about, either the writing of rule or the failure to write a rule, which then carry out that specific legislative grant of power. In Wisconsin, we define a rule thus on the screen there, and what's interesting, our definition of what a rule is really quite broad. It's a statement of policy or general order of general application. So remember that as we go through the presentation here on what is a rule in Wisconsin. As the power of administrative agencies expanded really over time, and I would point to really the 1980s, the 1990s, as the increase of administrative agency powers, a question that became discussed, and this is at the bedrock of a lot of regulatory reform, is how to effectively check state and federal agencies to ensure that they don't overstep the authority that's granted to them by the legislative body, remembering that the legislative bodies are the people's representatives. They're the elected officials. It's at the bedrock of our Constitution in terms of separation of powers concerns, legislative versus executive branches. And we have this issue of the so-called unelected bureaucrat who's making decisions on what the law is, as opposed to the elected and people who can be, throw the bums out, people who can be elected out of office via our democratic process. There's no check on those unelected bureaucrats in some ways. And then to make matters worse, as is highlighted on this slide, administrative agency powers have grown significantly as a result of court cases. And this is not true. This is true not just in our state. It's true in many state and federal cases that have been decided as disputes get litigated through the court system. In Wisconsin specifically, but again, we see it in other cases across the country, courts have really expanded the power of administrative agencies by looking to general grants of authority that might be in the introductory language of a statute or a legislative grant of power to an agency, and also finding implied authority. Essentially, if the legislature created and empowered an agency to do X, well, then by implication, they also empowered the agency to do Y and Z. And that is just what we've seen historically in terms of the growth of power among administrative agencies at the state and federal level. So I mentioned the regulatory reform agenda of Governor Walker's administration upon his election in 2010. Regulatory reform, among other priorities, we all lived through the Act 10 priority. That was one of his priorities that he ran on. But reg reform was high on the list as well. And you see, I quoted here, something from the Office of the Governor issued just a month after his election in 2010, where this concept of unelected bureaucrats imposing rules and regs that are based on general duties and general powers, and he identified it as a priority of his administration to correct. This was very early on and quite a while ago now, 7 years ago. So Act 21, which is what our lawsuit was really about, I recognize that it deals with feed storage runoff, it dealt with VTAs, it dealt with calf hutch lots, but really the bedrock of DBA's lawsuit was to enforce Act 21. And so what is Act 21? This is a very brief overview that I'll give you of it. It was enacted in June of 2011, so it's been around for a long time. It's been, to some extent, largely ignored for those intervening years. But this is what the reforms actually did, and I've just bulleted some of the highlights of the statute, and the most important of which for this presentation is the last one, and that is this concept of implied authority to administration has been statutorily eliminated by the adoption of Act 21 in 2011. And here's the language. This is the money language in the statute. Basically, no agency may implement or enforce any standard requirement or threshold. So if you think about it, based on what I said earlier about how a rule is defined so broadly, no agency may implement any policy, if you will, or enforce any standard or requirement as a term or a license or condition of any license. So think about it in the concept of your permits that you hold on your dairy farms, unless that requirement is explicitly required or explicitly permitted by a statute or properly adopted rule. The reason that the legislature chose the word explicit is to get at this concept of implied authority, right? It has to be explicit, has a dictionary definition. It also has a meaning under law. It has to have explicit, the legislation has to have explicitly required or delegated authority for the agency to adopt and enforce a standard or requirement, and again, playing off of the broad definition of rule, a rule. Basically, it makes clear that, additionally, that descriptions of legislative intent or purpose, or sort of what we would describe as lawyers as preamble language in statutes, are not to be the type of explicit authority that the legislature was thinking about when they adopted this regulatory reform back in 2011. So that's all by way of background. And now let's fast forward to 2016. In the spring of 2016, our DNR, and this is, by the way, identified to us as an association predominantly by the methods that John and Erin talked about. Calls, emails, descriptions of concern, communicated by and to our board members, by members to our staff members, identifying that this stuff was going on. And of course, we pay attention to these developments that impact our membership. Our DNR basically largely ignored Act 21 limitations until now. And these two actions by the department in the spring of 2016 essentially highlights the fact that they largely ignored Act 21, despite directions that each administrative agency had to have a strategy for implementing Act 21's requirements. Essentially, very quickly, in the spring of 2016, EPA issued a report which is part of their 5-year enforcement review of DNR's various programs. And they issued a report on the CAFO program, and they criticized DNR with respect to some of the things that DNR was doing with respect to regulation of other wastewater, processed wastewater, which I'll get to later in the presentation, coming off of the production area of permitted CAFOs. The second event was in March of 2016. EPA issued a letter expressing quote-unquote concerns about the performance of vegetative treatment areas, which have been installed at a lot of farms as a component of a feed storage runoff containment and control system. In response to those two actions, DNR very quickly did two things. First off, it issued a statewide letter in March of 2016 that unilaterally declared calf hutch areas were subject to engineering plan and specification approval. Those engineering plans and designs that John was mentioning earlier, and requiring that it would require an evaluation of those areas, it would require an engineering plan be adopted, and in fact declared in this letter that only facilities designed to meet certain NRCS standards that were nowhere found in the administrative code that governs the CAFO program, that is the standard that would be enforced statewide, okay? Kind of sounds, remember what I said earlier about the statutory definition of a rule? Sounds like a rule to me. Looks like it, quacks like it. The second thing they did was they began to routinely reject and return, and I know we've got a lot of engineering friends in the agricultural engineering firm friends in the audience that I see, and I'm sure you've had this happen to you back at that time. Basically, you were designing systems that met the current standards that were in play, but based on this EPA letter and the department's sort of unilateral determination that those standards aren't good enough anymore, they began to return those designs and said, good try, you met all the standards, but we've just moved the rules on the game board, and you have to resubmit now to meet our new rules, and that new rule is 100% containment of any of the feed storage runoff. And the department also began immediate work on a guidance document to say how they were going to implement this new standard, this new 100% containment standard. So what did DBA do about it? Again, I said we started to hear this quite frequently. My phone began to ring. John and Erin's phone began to ring. Jennifer Koenig, who's on the DBA board at GHD, was very outspoken in identifying this as a concern, and I commend her for being a moving force behind what we're about to talk about. DBA responded very quickly. We pointed out a number of weaknesses. We basically wrote a white paper, and we presented that white paper to the governor's office. We presented that white paper to DNR leadership, and we said, do you know what your agency is up to? They're causing a lot of disruption on our dairy farms right now, a lot of uncertainty, and in fact, even enforcement actions were starting to be taken by the DNR, relying on that 100% containment issue with respect to feed storage. So we wrote a white paper and pointed out the weaknesses in the EPA's analysis, and we pointed out further that they were enforcing the ELG stands for an effluent limitation guidelines, term of art under the Clean Water Act. The effluent limit that they were identifying, which is basically the no discharge standard from the production area, grew out of shorthand, but was incomplete and was inaccurate, in fact, under law. And DNR and EPA were not shy about this at all. They publicized the fact that our focus is moving away from safe and efficient manure storage and application, and it's moving to these areas of wastewater or runoff over the production area from other sources. They were very vocal about that. We clarified for DNR and for the governor's office and for DNR leadership, and we pointed out to the DNR lawyers what the true effluent guideline really is, and I'm going to cover it. There is, under existing law, this is existing law, by the way. We didn't make up new law. We simply clarified that the law they were talking about was not accurate in terms of what existing law is. There is no discharge of pollutants from the production area of a CAFO to navigable surface waters allowed, unless it is allowed because there's an exemption where you have a containment structure that is designed to collect or contain the 25-year, 24-hour event. That's not unique to Wisconsin. That is the federal effluent limit under the Clean Water Act and its implementing regulations, okay? Wisconsin goes further. By the way, some of you may be from states where that's all you have to meet. You have to meet the no discharge to a navigable surface water. Note I didn't say no discharge to a wetland, no discharge to a non-navigable tributary, no discharge to a navigable surface water unless you have a containment system that is designed and maintained to meet that storm event. Some states stop at that because that's where the federal rules stop. Wisconsin goes further. Additionally, in Wisconsin, there can be no discharge of pollutants from the production area that would result in either a surface water or groundwater standards violation, or that would negatively impact the functional values of wetlands. So that's Wisconsin law. It was Wisconsin law in 2016 when DNR made these proclamations. It still is Wisconsin law today as we sit here. We met with DNR leadership on this no less than 5 times throughout, that should be 2016, not 2010, throughout 2016 into early 2017. Meanwhile, our phone is ringing about DNR staff implementing this new 100% containment rule, which is not the law, see above, in the context of review of engineering plans, in the context of permit reissuance inspections, and issuing notices of violation, and taking enforcement actions based on those notice of violations. And so finally, this is not DBA's first instinct is to run to court. We tried to exercise every ability to correct and try to get the department to go back to enforcing the rules that are actually on the book, the laws that have actually been properly promulgated. In light of Act 21, what I said earlier, we finally had to take some action because we were not getting traction and things were not getting better out in the field, largely because we were hearing from a lot of you. And so our firm, and I want to recognize one of my partners, Joe Olson here from our Milwaukee office sitting in the front, was the lead litigator that worked with me on this. Our firm filed a lawsuit on DBA's behalf against DNR in Brown County Circuit Court back in July of 2017. We asserted that these actions, that the 2 specific actions that I mentioned earlier, were clearly in violation of Act 21. And we basically asked the court to enforce Act 21 against and correct these variations where DNR got off the reservation in terms of the process that they should have followed. We filed a very detailed complaint. And the reason we did that, in Wisconsin we have what is called notice pleading, but we filed a very detailed complaint to basically explain the story, explain everything that I've talked about to this point. What is Act 21? What is the law in terms of the proper discharge standard? What has DNR done beginning in March of 2016 that violates the discharge standard and violates the rules imposed by Act 21? We did that basically to educate the state's lawyers that we were right. And we were able to very quickly negotiate a negotiated settlement and resolution of the case, which was, I will say, a total vindication of DBA's position. The settlement, and let's transition and look at that. The settlement's publicly available. If you haven't seen it, we can certainly get it to you, approach any one of us, but it's publicly available. It required that DNR withdraw at that time its draft feed storage runoff control guidance. Remember I said they started working on a guidance to implement these new rules. We required in the settlement that the department acknowledge that NR 243, the rule that has been properly promulgated and developed, acknowledges the use of wastewater treatment strips or VTAs in the code, and therefore it's legal to use them. If they don't want that standard to be used, or they want to change the rule, they have to go through the rulemaking process. That's what Act 21 says. And then we'll all get an opportunity to provide input. We, our opponents, the public, the citizens of Wisconsin, under good, open government, get an opportunity to have our voices heard on that. It's not a DNR employee sitting in a cubicle over at Jeff 2 that gets to make that decision. And that's what Act 21's about, and that's what our lawsuit was about. Further, the settlement required that they declare that calf hutch lots are not reviewable facilities. This next bullet, I think, is a very important one. The department approached a lot of these regulatory inspections with respect to these two issues, basically presuming a discharge. What I mean by that is, you probably have all seen them. Here's a Google Earth image, and they'll draw a line. They'll say, well, the runoff goes here, and then it goes across this 100-acre cornfield through this grassed waterway, and then eventually 1.5 miles down the road, it reaches a navigable surface water. And they thought that was evidence, okay? That's, again, someone taking a map and drawing lines. That's not evidence of a discharge. And it's certainly not evidence of a discharge that would cause or result in the violation of a surface water standard. So they can no longer presume a discharge. The burden has shifted back to where it appropriately is. And that is, they cannot come to your farm and presume that there's a discharge occurring. That's illegal under the DBA settlement. And then lastly, we required that they provide a statewide notice. Why is that? And that is because, remember, they sent out a statewide letter saying calf hutch lots shall now henceforth be designed this way. And so unless you're paying attention, to the settlement agreement and the back and forth that had been going on, people wouldn't know. So we required that they send out a statewide notice. And this is a thing of beauty. And I apologize for all the words, but I reproduced the entire statewide notice for you because it was required under the settlement agreement, and it is a statewide notice that they have formally withdrawn their program guidance with respect to the feed storage runoff. They'll not use that guidance any further. They've formally rescinded any past statement. So if you received a letter that said, you have to design now your calf hutch lot facility under an engineered control, you may still make the business decision to do so, by the way. You have to make your own, and I'll talk about this in a minute, your own risk management decisions on your farm in terms of what you're comfortable with. But we just didn't want DNR telling you, making that decision for you without the support of law. And this notice just continues. And there I've highlighted the shall not presume the existence of a discharge to navigable waters. And the next clause is very important, but will evaluate CAFO production areas on a case-by-case basis. So our position all along, and this is very important, our position all along was never that all VTAs work, all VTAs are great. If you have a VTA, you don't have to worry about anything. That was not our position. Our position is it's a site-specific determination based on your own geographic layout, based on your distance to a navigable surface water or other groundwater feature that may be of concern, given what I said earlier about what the state's rule is, where it layers on groundwater and wetlands. It's a site-specific determination. And that's what we said was wrong with DNR's view of saying, okay, here's the baby and the bathwater going out as soon as EPA raised an issue. So it's very important that we're not going to make the same mistake DNR did and say all VTAs are great, you got no worries in Wisconsin anymore. Don't take that message away from this presentation, because we've been very consistent to say that it is a site-specific determination about how your system, where your system's located and how it's performing. Because now let's focus on sort of what happens next, what happens from here. A couple of key messages. Feed storage runoff, both leachate coming from feed storage as well as runoff from, your facility. The desire of your facility is to keep clean water clean and capture, collect, contain, treat, manage dirty water. So a lot of the engineers that come to your facilities are looking at how can I design your facility so that we can manage less water, because we want clean water to stay clean, not to be impacted or touched. Raw materials, manure, bedding, things that would turn clean water into processed wastewater. I put the definition of processed wastewater right up there on the screen because runoff from feed storage, runoff from calf hutch lot areas are defined as production area processed wastewater under law. It's a regulated substance, okay? So it means you have to do something with that, and you need to work with your engineers. A lot of excellent ones in the room, as I said earlier. Work with your engineers to design your facility to minimize the amount of processed wastewater your facility generates. Water that comes into contact with any raw materials, okay? So think about that from feed storage or your commodity storage, right? Or animal byproducts, including manure or bedding or feed. So clearly, it's very important that this lawsuit did not hold, I will say again, this lawsuit did not result in a determination that you don't need to worry about feed storage runoff and you don't need to worry about calf hutch lot runoff. That is not the conclusion of this lawsuit. Those are still processed wastewaters that you have to manage. And I just threw the definition of production area up there so that you could see that embodies the concept under law of raw material storage. And now I'm reminding you again of what is your obligation, given what I just said about processed wastewater. Your obligation is that you cannot discharge manure, we all know that, but you also cannot allow the discharge of processed wastewater pollutants into navigable waters, again, unless you have a collection or containment facility designed to collect the 25-year, 24-hour event. Remember, DNR was going to implement via a letter a requirement that you collect 100%. And some of you spent money on designs that collect 100%. Now, if you did that, I will say this, you have managed your risk. Because you presumably, so long as you're collecting 100% of your processed wastewater, and you're then managing it appropriately, you will never be in a discussion with the department about whether your facility was designed, managed, and maintained to meet the 25-year event. Okay? What you've done essentially is you've bought insurance. You've paid for risk management. Okay? So all is not lost. But further, you cannot allow this stuff to discharge into waters of the state. Again, this is a Wisconsin add-on, and I've got the sites there. That would result in noncompliance with groundwater standards, surface water standards, or impair the functional value of a wetland. And again, the key is that because they can no longer presume a discharge, it's a site-specific analysis. So you'll still need to look at your facility. You'll need to look at your layout. You'll need to see whether the discharge coming off of your VTA goes into a 100-acre internally drained cornfield, no risk, or is 30 feet from a navigable surface water, high risk. So those are still the determinations that you'll need to make on your own. So what do we see as what's next? How will the department respond? First thing, I'd implore all of you, if you're having interactions with the department moving forward after this settlement on the two areas of concern, but not just limited to the two areas of concern, it's always worthwhile to ask yourself, where is the explicit authority for them to require what they're asking me to do? That is not an offensive question, okay? It's not something that anyone should look at like you're trying to, quote, skirt the law. No, you're trying to determine whether or not the law is in fact being followed. So be open to having those conversations, with your engineering team, with your legal team, with DBA. But specifically on these two issues, we're watching very carefully how the department is responding post-settlement. We're watching whether they are being true in their actions to what their words were. And the state's lawyers are watching this as well. So as we see things or hear of things, again, this is not the end. This is, I think, a tremendous vindication of Act 21 and a tremendous vindication of you as an organization being willing to stand up for your members and being willing to say, hey, wait a minute, you want us to follow the law. And by the way, I work with a lot of dairy producers, and I got to tell you, I am extremely proud to represent this industry because as a client base, you people are rule followers, okay? You're rule followers. You want to know that there's some rationale behind a rule or a law, but you people conduct your businesses in compliance with law. And so when they ask that of us, we're just simply asking that of them, that they too have to follow the law, meaning they've got to follow their settlement. So if you're hearing things or you're experiencing things that you think may not quite be right based on everything you heard from Crass today, call us and let us know that. What do we expect to see from DNR while they still have this program? I think we're going to see an increase in groundwater monitoring requests. The installation of groundwater monitoring facilities associated with the production area of CAFOs. There are several CAFOs already that have groundwater monitoring, but I think we're going to see that on an uptick, right, in the wake of this. We're going to see, as you go through your permit reissuance, there's going to be the reevaluation of facilities under new standards that do get developed and properly promulgated over time. So that's going to be ongoing. You're going to see, you think, I've had a permit I'm on my third permit cycle. I've had a permit for 15 years. They've never looked at that area before. Why are they looking at it now? It was good then, isn't it grandfathered? Well, there's going to be increased and continuing attention, I think, on existing facility evaluations. Another element we're starting to see is an intense focus on separation from saturation for your storage and containment facilities forever. Their position currently is that not only do you have to show that at the time you built your storage that you attained the appropriate separation from saturation that's required by administrative code and design standard, you have to show it forever. And we're seeing this issue may end up in court, but we're seeing this issue recur repeatedly at operations. So, we're not out of the woods yet. John already mentioned, and we talked about in the prior session, the program move to DAC cap. Really need your help on that. Need your phone calls to the legislature. Need your attendance at Ag Day at the Capitol to help promote that policy change. That's incredibly important. I'll just note a couple of other things in closing here and then take some questions before you're all adjourned to lunch. And that is that at the end of last year, EPA issued every 2 years, EPA issues its top enforcement priorities. Under the Trump administration, this is new, and that is CAFOs had been on the EPA's every other year enforcement priority list really since the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's the first time that you didn't make the list. So my position is it's because we're doing the right things. And in a world of limited resources, they've decided that they're a bigger fish to fry. But I think that's an important development at EPA. Just a couple of other things about Act 21 to kind of complete the picture here, since we started with Act 21 and it was the bedrock of the lawsuit. Regulatory reform continues. It continues to be a priority for this legislature, this administration, and here are a couple of examples. One, an Attorney General's opinion that was issued. Again, Attorney General's opinions do not have the force and effect of law, but they are advisory. They're often cited by courts. And the Attorney General, who I know is on the program tomorrow to talk with you all, in a case involving sprinkler systems in commercial buildings, issued an opinion at the end of last year indicating that Act 21 applies, and therefore rules that were adopted even before its adoption in June of 2011 can be reviewed for whether explicit statutory authority exists now for what the rule was adopted even before Act 21's adoption. That's the opinion of the Attorney General's office, again, in December. Also, we had a couple of regulatory reform bills. The REINS Act, which is modeled after a federal counterpart, was adopted last summer. And there's a bill right now that's circulating for sponsorship that would essentially do the next level of regulatory reform when it comes to judicial deference to agencies, the development of guidance and requiring that they follow a specific process, and also not allowing any statewide rulemaking to occur as a result of a settlement of a lawsuit. This whole concept of sue and settle on the federal level is notorious on the environmental activist side. Some could say that, you know, we took a page out of their playbook for our Act 21 lawsuit, but, you know, activist groups will sue an agency and then get an outcome that they want in a privately negotiated settlement, and then the agency will launch on rulemaking to implement that settlement. That would bring that to a close. All right, so I'm going to stop my comments there and then open it up for a few minutes of questions if there are any from the floor. Mr. Pfaff.
Be a requirement of more groundwater monitoring, and you can't contaminate the groundwater. Now, if you had, say, groundwater at 4 feet, and so you were running some feed pad runoff out there, if there was existing water at 4 feet, I know regulatory-wise we'll sample that water. We normally haven't made us do that, but they'd like us to do that. But if you did sample that water, what would the criteria be? Would the criteria be, yeah, if you're over 10, you're contaminating? Or let's even say it's normally dry there, but you have perched water at times,
right.
Wet times, you sample that. Yeah, you would maybe be over 10, but it's normally not wet. So how
Right.
would some of those things work?
So, Bob, your question raises two of the, you know, I'd say hottest topics when we deal with that scenario. One is the whole issue of perched groundwater and getting DNR to migrate off of the view that under our existing law, all groundwater is groundwater for regulatory purposes. But yet there are, you know, there's perched groundwater that appears and is nothing other than essentially water that is infiltrating slowly or is being perched up by a geologic feature that you know, acts as like an aquitard and does not allow that water to perch through quickly. Dig a hole in the central sands versus in Ashland County, and you're going to see different results in terms of how quickly that water moves through the system. The water we're really concerned about, or should be concerned about, is the water that is serving the regional aquifer. The water that, you know, we still have, I haven't seen the most recent study results, but I think it's still like 70% of Wisconsinites get their water from private wells. And those wells are constructed in, you know, aquifer systems that produce enough water to supply private residences and other businesses. So what the water we really should be concerned about, which Bob's question gets at, is this, you know, in some respects, what the water 4 feet down is, I don't know of anybody that's drinking that water, right? It really doesn't matter so much as what the water, you know, 65 feet down is, where the private wells are screened, or 170 feet down, or 470 feet down, depending on your setting. So we've been able, I think, to successfully discuss with the agency about what really matters in that regard. And the second issue is that where groundwater monitoring is required, you deal with the conundrum of establishing what are the background groundwater quality conditions. So if you think about it, the engineers in the room that have dealt with the concept of an alternative concentration limit in a WPDS permit, where you're being judged on your actions, not judged on what's coming onto your property from upgradient sources, those would be the two concepts that would be at play, Bob. And there's no silver bullet. The response is, and you know, where we've advised clients is where you're required to do groundwater monitoring, you are almost duty bound to yourself to add additional wells or figure out what are the background groundwater quality conditions. Because, you know, you may look at that and, oh yeah, we're over 10 for N, but the background groundwater quality coming onto our site is, you know, 25. So they're very difficult and complex issues, but I see those playing out more frequently. It's not a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's the answer. Anyone else? It's always fun begging for questions right before lunch. Mr. Saporsky.
Any more discussion on the karst issue and just where we are with that? Those of us that are affected by it?
Yeah, so that's NR 151 that John mentioned in the prior presentation, and the current status of that is that it had appeared on an earlier DNR board agenda and was removed. It's now been placed back on the DNR board agenda. Erin, when is that meeting scheduled? Thank you. Wednesday, the 24th, is coincidentally when the DNR board is meeting. And, you know, DBA has been very involved in the development of the revisions of NR 151. Right now, you know, originally the proposal was to have the rule applicable to basically anywhere in the U shape from, you know, Door Kewaunee County down around up to the western edge of the state. Right now, it's just applicable to the eastern seaboard. And DBA still has concerns with that rule and will be citing concerns about that rule because it applies. We don't have any concerns. I shouldn't say any concern. And really, I think John and Erin are better equipped to articulate what the current policy of the board is, but my understanding is that the board's position is that, you know, we will live with and work around the 0 to 5 foot additional restriction in those areas on the eastern seaboard. But what we have concerns about is a regulatory requirement that would apply down to 20 feet where we don't even have maps. We don't even have current mapping tools that we can point farmers to that would define their regulatory point of compliance. So that's a problem. I mean, in regulatory law, you can ask businesses to do anything, but you have to say, what is your point of compliance? How do I know when I'm in compliance versus not? And this would argue you'd have to dig 20-foot test pits in some circumstances. Erin, I don't know if you want to add anything else on the 151 question.
Dave covered it pretty well, I think.
So we still have concerns. I think thanks, Shawn, other ag groups, I think are ready to give it up on it, but we're gonna take our concerns forward.
Is only doing it on the eastern side of the state kind of a divide and conquer attack, or is that?
No, that's based on science and based on basically the Silurian bedrock differences there versus the same arguably karst bedrock, but not Silurian bedrock on the western side of the state. So it's based on a rationale in science. Should this be the last one? This will be the last question, and then we'll get you off to lunch.
I missed the session earlier this morning. Could you elaborate just a little bit on this shift to DAT cap that you mentioned there?
Sure. The association has long believed that the CAFO permitting program, which is currently housed at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, more logically and efficiently should be housed at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection for a couple of reasons. One is we've got significant nutrient management planning expertise at DACCAP. DACCAP has been in charge, since 1997 of implementing our non-point program in the state and implementing the nutrient management planning program in the state, working through counties. And they've got a significant amount of expertise. At DNR, we've got, I think, 2 nutrient management specialists who don't even, in one case, does not hold the credential, the Certified Crop Advisor credential, and we would not have that. That's not to attack that person personally. It's just the state of play. So that's one reason. A second reason is efficiencies in terms of familiarity with agricultural engineering. Again, through a lot of cost-shared practices where the Department of Ag is working in an advisory role with county conservation offices, a lot of cost-shared improvements, agricultural engineering, has long been done at the Department of Ag. And so for those 2 reasons predominantly, the suggestion was made to move the program. It was in the governor's budget, then removed as a matter of policy, and then and DBA has been working on this with the governor's office and with agency leadership for some time. And recently at the last, fall, at the governor's rural summit, he announced that he supports this and, in fact, would lead an effort to move the program. So we're working feverishly to attempt to get that accomplished yet this legislative session. We have the challenge of the calendar, just given the number of floor days left in the legislature. But it is something that the agencies have, in fact, been working on ever since the governor originally put it in his budget, and then it was converted to a study. The agencies have been working together. They've got work groups on both sides of this. So we think that this will result in a much more efficient permitting and regulatory program. There's been a lot of complaints about it takes 18 to 24 months in Wisconsin to get a CAFO permit, and investment is moving out of this state into other states where you can get a permit in 3 months. So we need to do something because the existing system is broken. And so we need to fix it, and that's a part of the solution. Well, thank you all for your attention and participation, and we'll see you around the show.
All right, I just have a few announcements. Lunch is happening now downstairs in the exhibit hall B. And we'd also like to give another thank you to Dave Crass and Michael Best for sponsoring this and for their hard work for us. And another reminder, innovation stage sessions will be running from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. also in Exhibit Hall B during the trade show, so head that way. And then for those of you who are members of Dairy Business Association and EDGE, our annual meeting will start at 1:30 up in one of the ballrooms up here. So thanks everybody and enjoy lunch.